Hello, my Lynn N Things family and friends. Welcome on back to the channel, guys. I am so happy to have you. First, I do want to say thank you to each and every one of my subbies. I see I have reached the 800. Oh my gosh, you guys are just so amazing. I am so grateful to be growing in this channel, and I'm just grateful for all of you, because without you guys, I could not do that. So, I am going to give you a chance to also on this channel, on this video, to if you haven't already entered my giveaway for my 800 subby giveaway. Though this is going to be my story time with Lynn. It's Saturday, and so it's story time with Lynn, and you know we got picking up in our next couple of chapters in the As I Am by Cicely Tyson, her story. But again, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you so very much for helping me reach another wonderful milestone. And so in order to be able to join or get into the giveaway, I'm going to, like I said, give you another chance on this video. I did do it on the last one, and I'm going to do it on this one. And then I will be calling my winner, or picking my winner, in next couple of days. I think maybe Monday. So I'll give it till Monday to pick my winner. So all you have to do in the comment section of this video is put hashtag 800 down there. Of course, you must be a subscriber of the channel. You have to be a visible subscriber of the channel. I have to be able to check and see that yes, you are visible, and also live in the 50 states. That's it. So if you want to join that giveaway, please go ahead, feel free, and put the hashtag 800 down in the comment section, along with your thoughts about what I'm going to be getting into today and these next couple of chapters, and where we're going to find out more about this wonderful woman, guys. Okay, so we're going to get started, but before we do, I want you to get comfortable, honey. I want you to get comfortable. So today, my candle of the evening for reading is going to be my Embrace Positivity. Of course, it's already done, guys, and it smells amazing. It smells like passion fruit to me, but it is the Citrus Summit, which she has in a couple. I have like the spray and I have the candle, so I do have it. But instead of it smelling citrusy to me, I don't know, it's making me think of passion fruit. But of course, you know, I have to light it, so I got my cute little, y'all, I love this thing. I found this thing at Dollar Tree. Just be very careful, because oh my goodness, it does light fast. So we're going to get that started. Candle is lit, guys. And that's going to start our ambiance. Now, if you're going to be watching me or listening to this, like, you can have me playing in the background, like while you're doing, you know, dishes or housework, or maybe you are at work or just taking a break and you're just doing some me time and you want to hear a story. That would be perfect. You could just play me in the background, or if you just like to watch, and this is, like I said, your time, and you want to spend these few minutes with me listening to this, please do whatever you feel. Get comfortable, get you a little drink, get you a candle if you like, and let's get down to some more of this awesome story, guys. So we are in chapter 2, and it is titled String Bean, guys. String Bean. Here we go. My mother strolls along the sidewalk, pushing me, 6 months old, in a carriage. The South Bronx is just yawning awake in its wide boulevards, not yet teeming with immigrant families scrambling toward their trains. Mom has risen early from solitude before the day's responsibilities intrude. A Jewish woman with short black curls framing her kind face approaches. My mother's instinct is not to flee. It is 1925, in an era in which neighbors are still more trusted than feared. The lady leans under the large hood of the carriage and studies my squinty face and bald head. "Take care of that child," she whispers. Mommy scans the woman's eyes in search of what she means. "She has a sixth sense," she continues. "She's going to make you very proud one day, and she's going to take care of you in your old age." The lady smiles and nods and then disappears down the sidewalk. As my mother stares after her, the two had never spotted each other amid the factories and alleyways of the neighborhood. They will never again cross paths. Yet on this morning, during the daybreak of my life, Providence sweeps them together for a singular exchange. As I lay there, swaddled and slumbering, as oblivious to the roar of passing locomotives as I am to the prophecy of a stranger. Remember, guys, we're reading parts of the book. I won't be reading every single thing, so there will be a little skipping around, okay? Next it says, my parents grew up together in Nevis, an island cradled between the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, in the British West Indies. My mother, Frederica Theodosia Huggins, was the only child of Mary Jane Sargent, a seamstress, and Charles Huggins, a fisherman, who drowned when his boat capsized during a storm. Mary Jane and Charles were never married. My father, William Augustine Tyson, was one of 8 children, y'all, or at least the 8 he knew about. His dad, John Edward Tyson, the overseer of a wealthy family's estate, was said to have fathered at least 24 children. 8 of them were with my dad's mother, Carol, or Caroline, Matilda Wilkes Tyson. My parents' villages sat miles apart, but there was no distance at all between the values that governed each. My mother and father grew up in the Episcopal Church, under the watchful gaze and doting palm of the faithful. Rearing was done in the collective. With a side eye and an unsparing rod, a priest or a parishioner could train up a child, be that younger his own or another's. It was in this kind of spiritual community, one encircled by the guardrails of love and discipline, and that my parents' heels were grounded. It is also where, on a Sunday when my mother was 13, her path in life was set. On that morning, the congregation gathered for my mother's confirmation. In keeping with their tradition, every saint was dressed head to toe in ivory. After my mom received the Holy Sacrament, she and the other youth stood near an enormous window in the sanctuary. Through the opening flew a white dove, fully extending its wings before landing right onto my mother's head. And any other child would have shrieked and bolted, but not my mom. Even then, she was as steady as she was reticent. She just stared ahead as if such an unusual occurrence had been expected to happen. This child should not stay here, the pastor declared to the congregants. She should go to America. Years earlier, my mother's Aunt Miriam had moved from Nevis to the nation of dreamers. The dove, said the minister, was appointing Frederica as the next in the family to follow. Soon after, Mary Jane wrote to Miriam about her special niece, this chosen child, and asked that she prepare the way for her. A decade later, once her papers were in order, she indeed made the journey. My father had arrived a year before she did. And now we're going to the next part. As my father grew through adolescence, he became more sweet on Frederica. Her introversion was a perfect balance for his charisma. Love, invisible but palpable, lingered between them, and yet the relationship's strongest connective tissue was their shared sense of faith and family. My mom never told me how my dad proposed to her. I know only that by the time my father set out for the United States, he'd made clear intentions to one day make Frederica his bride. All right. Throngs of the West Indians flocking to New York in those years typically moved into their either Hell's Kitchen or the Bronx. But my father settled first in Brooklyn with my mother's Aunt Miriam and her husband, Uncle Patrick, whom he'd met in Nevis. He divided his time between there and East Orange, New Jersey, in the home of his eldest brother, George, who transitioned to the United States before he did. My uncle and his family eventually moved from East Orange to nearby Mount Clair. My dad had honed a talent for carpentry in Nevis and brought that skill with him. In addition to handcrafting crafting wood pieces and bureaus and bed frames that drew squeals of delight from his patrons, he operated a fruit and vegetable pushcart on the streets of Hell's Kitchen. As if those jobs weren't enough to fill my dad's workdays, he enlisted in the 369th Infantry Regiment, the first all-black National Guard unit, famously known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Dad trained at Camp Whitman in New York, but never served overseas. My father and mother corresponded across the Atlantic, expressing in hastily rendered cursive and without the luxury of a telephone their longing to reunite. In 1920, the year my parents were both 23, my mother at last joined my father in New York. On the afternoon she boarded the Macedonia, I can only imagine the brew of excitement and uncertainty she felt about leaving the world she knew and entering another, one unfamiliar to her. It was at that last time she'd ever see her mother in this life. And as a mom tearfully waved goodbye from the ship's deck, her spirit surely sensed that finality. Mom moved into Aunt Miriam and Uncle Patrick's brownstone, and as she and my father resumed their courtship, Dad left Miriam's place. Living together before marriage, or shacking up as it was known, was frowned upon in their church community. So Dad stayed between the homes of his brother George and his favorite sister Zora, who had settled into the Bronx neighborhood of Mount Vernon. My mom began work as a sleep-in nanny, taking care of a little white boy during the week and returning home to her aunt and her uncle's place on the weekends. She and my father, elated to be near one another, picked up where they'd left off. They also squirreled away every nickel they could in preparation for an eventful wedding. Not long after Mom's arrival in the United States, she and my father became formally engaged. I was born scrawny with a heart murmur, twin liabilities in West Indian culture. When the doctors discovered the murmur, they told my mother and father I probably wouldn't make it to 3 months old. My parents, who knew God and thus knew better, set out to prove medicine wrong. They got right to work on restoring me to good health and fattening me up, which, as they saw it, were one and the same. Mom and Dad hovered over me constantly. If I whimpered in the slightest or my eyes fluttered awake, my mother pulled me close to her bosom and nursed me as she stroked my head. After we'd moved from the Bronx to the east side, Daddy would put me in my stroller early in the mornings and walk me over to Central Park. "This child needs some fresh air in her lungs," he'd say on his way out the door. My murmur ultimately disappeared, but I was still skin and bones, so Mom trotted me all around town to this physician and that one, seeking assurance that I was healthy. "Will you please leave this child alone?" a doctor finally told her. "She's not fat, and she's never going to be." Mom was embarrassed, not because she'd smothered me half to death, but because her suffocating had become noticeable enough to draw rebuke. My mother had wanted to name me Miriam, after the aunt she treasured. By the time I was born, Aunt Miriam had passed away in a house fire, her body consumed by flames, but her presence never more strong. My dad, though, he also cherished Miriam, insisted on another name. "I want my first daughter to be called Cicely," he says. An adorable girl who lived next door to them in the Bronx had the name, and the first time he heard it, he decided that he'd one day bestow it upon his daughter. That in this barefaced story he told my mother. Years later, when I was grown, the truth would come spilling out. Most parents wouldn't dare admit to preferring one child over another. But in our home, the fact was not hidden. My father adored me and Emily. I don't know why, but Daddy just preferred girl children. Melrose, which is her brother, on the other hand, was my mother's heartthrob. No one called my brother by his given name. He abhorred the sound of it and insisted that his friends refer to him as Tyson. In the streets, Melrose received more attention than my dad often paid to him. A faded family photo captures the spirit of their puzzling dynamic. My smiling father stands strong, dressed sharp as a Rockefeller, with his shoulders squared. My brother, conversely, wears a somber expression and high water pants. Whenever my mother would pass that photo on our living room wall, she'd just shake her head and murmur, "Your father should have bought Bo a proper suit." Not only did my dad show little interest in grooming his son, he was also very hard on him. If Melrose cut up in class or brought some less than stellar grade, my father's scolds were louder than his encouragements. I have no doubt that my dad cared for my brother as much as he did my sister and me. He provided for all of us just the same. And in our culture, provision speaks a love language that the tongue may seldom profess. Emily was my father's other crown jewel. Dad borrowed my sister's nickname Molly from the Broadway show My Blue Heaven. "Just Molly and me, and baby makes three," Daddy would sing. "And we're happy in my blue heaven." Emily's given name came courtesy of my father's cousin. When she heard that my parents were having a third child and it was soon to be born on her birthday, she said to my dad, "If you name the baby after me, it'll be the happiest birthday I have ever had." Though Mom called me father face, I always thought Emily looked more like Dad. My sister's face was a full moon like his, whereas Mom and I had an almond shape. In my mind, then, shape rather than color was the strongest marker of similarity. Over the years, I've come to recognize both of my parents' faces in my own, depending on the character I'm portraying. As a child, I was quiet. My mother would take me and Emily with her to an outdoor market, one that stretched up Park Avenue from 111th to 116th. After his stop in Hell's Kitchen, my father usually parked his cart there. It was the West Indian meeting spot, or our public square. The hub pranced to his feet on Saturdays, with women in vividly colored head wraps throwing back their heads in laughter and trading gossip about whatever was happening in church or in the news headlines. "Tyson," someone would yell out at my mother across the stands, "Girl, where you been? I ain't seen you in 2 weeks." As Mom and her friends cackled and communed, I'd stand silently at her side. "Oh, she's just so shy," one of the women would say. Mom would glance down at me and smile and then go back to talking, until Emily had to pee so badly she'd contort her body into a pretzel. It's not simply that I was shy. Mostly, I was observant. Even as a child, I longed to understand what motivated people to do and say what they did. Why the sun opened its lids in the east and then shut them in the west. Why my battery-operated doll named Dolly, with her blonde locks and white paint peeling from her face, was constantly crying. I was so inquisitive that I once took apart a wristwatch, determined to find out what made it tick. I studied everything. When we were out in the streets, I'd notice people's feet. I still do. In fact, my eyes fall first on people's shoes, even before I look up at their faces. Our feet tell our stories. They carry us through this life, moving us from one sorrow and season, season through the next. Our gait can reveal us to be buoyant or bullish, dispirited or steadfast. I was a deep chestnut brown in a nation that considers the darker sister the less attractive one. Colorism, which cut its teeth on slave plantations, thankfully was not nurtured among the Tysons. I grew up surrounded by cousins whose hues spanned the color spectrum, from lily white, and there are a couple albino children in the extended family, to jet black. And yet, when it came to colorism in society at large, I was certainly not immune. No one had to tell me that the fairer skin and the narrower your nose and lips were, the more stunning you were considered. That belief permeated the atmosphere. My mother and other black women were mostly invisible to whites, and when they did see us, it was through the cracked and muddled lens of racial bias. In their view and in their advertisements, we were mammies and maids, subservient and ignorant, and yet somehow diligent, clean, and honorable enough to prepare their meals and rear their children. On the playground, I heard a looping trio of insults: skinny, nappy headed, the N word. The latter truly stung me on the day an Italian boy in my class, my bosom buddy, called me that. He and I lived across the street from one another, so even when we weren't in school, we played together. That ended on that morning. He came into our first grade class with a grin on his face and a not so nice little poem. My earliest memory is a street address. On a Saturday in spring of 1927, my mother took my brother, Emily, and me with her to visit some friends in Hell's Kitchen. We stayed out so long that by the time we got home, the sky was dark. We made our way up to 3rd Avenue, crossed over to 2nd, and then rounded the corner onto our street. Melrose walked next to us as he kicked along a tin can. I, then aged 2.5, had one hand clasped in my mother's right palm and the other, of course, in my mouth. Emily was holding Mom's left hand, and as we approached the apartment, I stared up. At the top of our building stood a row of numbers in large gold letters on the glass frontal: 219 East 102nd. The first chapter of my childhood unfolded at that address, the home we shared until I was 9. Our area was called the East Side Slums. Nowadays, it's known as East Harlem. Scarcity was and is the neighborhood's salient feature. We were poor, a reality I see most clearly in hindsight. When I was a child, it seemed we had so much of what we needed, largely because my parents were so enterprising. Our food stamps and blocks of bright orange government cheese were supplemented by the steady flow of vegetables that my father brought home from his produce cart. We ate well. My mother, a masterful seamstress who created exquisite garments from mere scraps of fabric, dressed me and Emily like little princesses, because in her view, we were. Our community was largely Italian, but also racially mixed, filled with parents who, like my own, toiled to lift their children's prospects. My parents worked relentlessly. Both rose before sunup, exhaustion sitting heavily on their eyelids. Mommy set out for the elevated train known as the L. She commuted to the Bronx to work as a domestic for various white families, bathing and feeding their youngins as a way to carve out a life for her own 3. In addition to pushing their produce cart all around town, my father and his business partner, Mr. Taylor, also set up shop close to our home at an open market between 101st and 102nd Streets. On Mom's days off, she often walked over and she helped at the cart. Entered the woman we knew as our Nana, a neighbor my mother befriended. In those years, when my siblings and I were too small to be at home on our own, Nana took care of us while our parents worked. We never knew our grandparents back in Nevis, and Nana came to feel like one to us. When you're poor, 2 of the few realities you can control are your own appearance and that of your immediate surroundings. My mother exercised powerful jurisdiction in both domains. Do not go out of this house with no dirty underwear, she stressed constantly. If you fall down sick in the street and your underwear are filthy, nobody's going to want to touch you. Before bedtime, I always removed my underpants, thoroughly washed them in the bathroom sink, and hung them up, using a wooden clothespin on a line outside our kitchen window. The last thing my mother did every evening was check that line. If she didn't spot my underwear out there, oh, she'd wake me up. What did you do with your underwear? She'd press as I sleepily rubbed my eyes and tried to remember. I'd sometimes still have them on, or else I'd tuck them someplace random. No matter how late it was, she'd pull me from that bed to complete my duty. In our home, cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness. It was the Heavenly Father personified. Under the Tyson roof, respect for elders was sacrosanct. Children had not a say, but a mandate to trust and obey in the words of the old hymn. Sassing my parents or any member of the community was enough to draw ire and a belt. My back talk took the form of willfulness. I might have been quiet, but I did plenty of rebutting in my head. I also did exactly the opposite whenever my mother instructed me to do. She'd say sit down, I'd stand up. Walk, she'd command, and I'd take off running. She kept close tabs on all of us. But with me, her sickly child, Mom's vigilance was devout. I craved space to move around without her always staring down over me, yet as I was never afforded the same freedom as Emily and Melrose. If the two of them went out to play, Mom would find a reason to keep me at her side. Sis, I think you're getting a cold, she'd say. Off my siblings would go, and there I'd sit, sulking and plotting my getaway. Try as my mother did to keep me within view, I often found my way outdoors and onto the subway. Even when I was as young as 8. When Mom and Dad had their business on Saturdays, I'd wait 15 minutes after she'd left the house, and then I'd dash through that door. I'd make my way over to 103rd Street and hop on the train and ride it all the way to the last stop in the Bronx. Once off, I'd stroll through the neighborhood, peeking into the windows of the beautiful suburban houses, savoring my freedom and alone time, swearing Emily and Melrose to secrecy. Oh wow, guys. My third grade teacher, Miss Sullivan, somehow spotted a potential in me that I didn't even recognize in myself. Prancing by my desk, she'd sing that famous tune, "You ought to be in pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures." Oh, what a hit that would be. I'm not sure what prompted her prediction. Perhaps I'd have flashed an impish grin or cast a penetrating stare in her direction, because it couldn't have been anything to do with speaking. All the time now, I remember her sidling up to me with her navy suit and brunette bob, and I think, Miss Sullivan, you were foretelling my future. Every afternoon, when me and my siblings got home from school, we were met with the question, "Where is your homework?" That query was followed by a command, "Change out of those school clothes." And I'm going to end this here, and now I'm just going to give you a little bit of a break, and then we're going to start chapter 3 called Church Girl. So go ahead if you need to take a break. I'll be right back. Okay guys, welcome back. And now chapter 3, Church Girl. Church was the cornerstone of my childhood. My mother was determined that our foundation be spiritual, just as hers had been. There was Sunday service, followed by Monday and Wednesday prayer. Friday was choir rehearsal. Emily and I were in choir as young children. On Thursdays and Fridays, there were usher board meetings, youth meetings, elder meetings, and any other gathering the pastor could dream up. On Saturdays, my family cleaned the church. When I tell you we were in God's house all the time, I mean that. We attended where many West Indians did, St. John's American Episcopal Catholic Church. In naming the church, our pastor clearly wanted to be inclusive, but our services followed the Episcopalian tradition. The original building, a storefront, was on 234 East 99th Street. The year I was 8, the congregation moved north to 1610 Lexington Avenue near 102nd Street. I still recall the Sunday when our 100 or so members walked from the old spot to the new one, carrying lighted candles as we sang, "Lead on, O King Eternal. The day of March has come." The second space was a 4-story brownstone converted into a place of worship. The sanctuary was on the main floor, and down below there was a cavernous basement for all those meetings. Reverend Joseph Byron, who grew up in St. Kitts, lived with his wife and their 5 children above the sanctuary. The very top floor was rented out, providing the church with an income stream. By day, Reverend Byron watched over his flock. As a side job, he managed a moving van and shipping business. Emily and I were the best dressed girls in church, as well as on the east side, period. Mom made sure that by sewing all of our clothes, most of them from scratch, others using the Butterick and McCall's patterns she kept stuffed in a drawer. As she stitched together her magic on a hand crank singer machine, her wrist rotating round and round, she periodically yelled out, "Sister, come on in here and try this on." Mom poked and prodded us with so many stick pins as we tried on a dozen versions of whatever she was making. It drove me mad. Church was the one place where my timidity fell away. The deacons' wives often staged little plays based on Bible stories for the youth to take part in. More than once, I was cast in the leading role of Mary, mother of Jesus. For all of my reticence, I relished delivering my lines as the members encouraged me on with claps and amens. I wasn't at all nervous to take the spotlight. That's because in my mom's mind, and thus in my own, I wasn't performing. A performance is what happened in the secular world, that sinful place Mom referred to as a den of iniquity. What we did in church was distinct from the realm and therefore sacred. I'm blessed to have been raised in two rich spiritual traditions, Episcopalian and Baptist. On any Sunday when my parents couldn't make it to service, my siblings and I would go with Nana. Her Baptist church was right next door to St. John's, but a universe away stylistically. When I was about 7, Nana said to me and Emily, "Wouldn't you girls like to sing for our congregation next Sunday?" Emily thought the idea sounded silly and declined. I, basking in the glow of a recent star as Mary in my own church, agreed. Mom and Emily and Melrose went to St. John's as usual, while Dad and I went with Nana to her service. "Please give a warm welcome to little Miss Cicely," the Reverend Hawkins announced. As the congregation applauded, my father had led me in my emerald velvet dress and lace-trimmed socks to the pulpit. The pastor handed me a microphone, and for a moment I just stood there, not sure what I'd sing. In lieu of a plan, I belted out the opening line of a number I'd often heard and loved there in Nana's church. "How do you do, my loving pastor? How do you do?" I hollered, half singing, half chanting. The room erupted as the organist quickly found my key and began accompanying me. A row of women in colorful wide-brimmed hats jumped up and lifted their hankies and hallelujahs before I could even launch into the next couple of refrains. "How do you do, congregation? How do you do?" I sang. 4 deacons made their way from the front pew to the pulpit and set me on a small little wooden chair. Each of them clasped one leg of the chair, hoisted me heavenward in unison, and began parading me through the aisles. "How do you do, God's children? How do you do?" I sang. After service, my father couldn't get home fast enough to tell my mother how proud he was of his sis. "She turned the place upside down," he gushed. Before he could finish his recounting, others from the church stopped in to give my mom the details as I stood there blushing. Honestly, I couldn't understand what the fuss was all about. All I knew was that when I was up there on that chair, my Mary Jane's dangling, my voice rising up from someplace deep within me, I felt the rush. The spirit, twisting and flailing and arching its back, had shuddered through me. And as it did, my shyness vanished. As far back as I can recall, I've known I have a sixth sense, an innate ability to see, feel, hear, taste, and smell events before they happen. Strong evidence of this prescience came in the winter of 1932, the December that I turned 8. On an afternoon when my parents were out working, I smelled smoke and thought the scent was coming from the building next door. Melrose and I went out to look around as well as to check on our neighbor, a woman our family knew very well. "I smell smoke," I told her when she opened the door. "What do you mean you smell smoke?" she asks. "I think something is burning," I said. She glanced at the living room, at the kitchen, behind her, and then back at me. "Well, nothing's on fire in here," she said. "I don't smell anything." That week, my mother had bought me a new pair of Sunday shoes. I felt so convinced of an impending blaze that I went into our closet, pulled out my box of Mary Jane's, and cradled it close to my chest. I was not about to let my shoes go up in smoke. In fact, I even slept with that box next to me on the rollaway. When no sparks flew that evening, I forgot all about what I had smelled. 2 days later, I awakened to the squeal of sirens slicing through the frigid air. In the building next door, there had been an electrical fire, one that began in our friend's apartment. The fire crew thankfully arrived soon enough to evacuate the place and douse the flames before they could spread. Later, when our neighbor came by and gave us that report, all I could think was, good Lord, I knew it. I had these premonitions frequently. Like the many times when I'd be talking about someone and then 10 minutes later that person would appear at the front door, or these occasions when I tell my mother that someone in our church was quite sick. How do you know, she'd ask. I saw it in a dream, I'd say. And sure enough, Reverend Byron would stop in with the news that the person I had seen in my dream had taken ill. In other instances, I'd overhear my parents talking in their bedroom. My dad would tell my mom that he'd run into so-and-so that day at the market. Mom would laugh and say, I know. What do you mean, he'd ask. Sister told me that yesterday. She says she dreamed it. My mother also had a sixth sense. I don't know whether her parents were born with it as well, but there's no question that my mother possessed it. Sister, come here and sit down, she said to me one morning before she left for work. I slid into the chair at our table and she locked her eyes on me. I dreamed last night that I saw you going through the window, she said. Don't wash any windows today, you hear me? It's a school day, I reminded her, and I only wash windows on Saturdays. Did you hear what I told you? She snapped. Do not wash any windows today. I nodded, hushed my mouth. That afternoon after school, Emily and I were playing in our apartment near a set of glass French doors that separated the living room from the bedroom. My sister flung open the two panels and then slammed them behind her. In an effort to keep me from closing in on her, I lunged toward the doors, but as I did, the glass shattered and sliced through my right arm, starting near my inside wrist and extending up 2 inches. Our neighbor, Miss O'Connor, heard the commotion and rushed over to find me lying in a pool of crimson. She wrapped my wrist in a towel and rushed me to a nearby drugstore. The pharmacist urged her to take me to the emergency room, where the doctor stitched me up. 9 decades later, the scar remains, a reminder of my mother's uncanny ability to predict, often with chilling accuracy, what would occur. At 2 a.m., I made my way downstairs to the main floor to use the bathroom. While in there, I heard the front door to the house creak open and then slam shut. I thought little of it. With so many relatives around, folks had been going and coming a lot. Who came in? My mother asked when I returned upstairs to bed. I don't know, I answered. What do you mean you don't know? She pressed. Weren't you just downstairs? Yeah, but I didn't see anyone, I told her, and I drifted off to sleep. And in my dream, Aunt Beatrice appeared and spoke to me. I hope I didn't frighten you this morning, she says. I wanted to say goodbye to all of my loved ones, and I was trying to make it back into my casket before anyone else missed me. The second my eyelids slid open later that morning, I sat up straight and announced to my mother, I know who that was last night, Mom. It was Aunt Beatrice who slammed that door. Mama didn't say a word. She also didn't seem surprised by my revelation and didn't quiz me about it. She just grinned, shook her head, and rose from her bed to begin preparing for the day. Maybe my Aunt Beatrice had also shown up in my mother's dreams as well. We each have many faces, various ways of appearing and behaving. In one moment, we may show remarkable steadfastness. In another, an aching vulnerability. We can be at turns tranquil and belligerent, jubilant and despairing. We are inherently multifaceted and yet marvelously complete. This was true of my mother and father, 2 human beings as nuanced and complex as any of us. As I grew up, I became acquainted with each of my mother's faces. There was her reserved nature, the quiet girl once known as Dosha. Whenever I heard someone call my mother by her childhood nickname, which was short for Theodosia, her middle name, I knew the person had known my mom since her days in Nevis. Dosha nodded more than she spoke. If a cashier greeted her in a store, she smiled sheepishly. That face of my mother reflected all that was innocent and generous and good in her. All the warmth and care her own mom once bestowed. Mom seldom talked about her mom, as she called her, but my mother's kindness across the miles said plenty. She did not have the financial resources to visit back at Nevis, but every chance she got, Mom would pack a large barrel with food and clothes and have Reverend Byron ship it to her mother. During holidays, she also sent a large ham. Before she closed up that barrel, she'd round up a few dollars, tie the bills to the foot of an old nylon stocking, and stick it someplace in between with the other gifts. Then there were Mom's other sides. At times, she was joyous, like when she sang while preparing supper. As she stirred one pot and lifted the lid from another, she'd have her head tied up in a scarf, her cotton Hoover apron over her house clothes, and her bare feet slid into my father's old shoes, which she turned into slippers by smashing down the backs of them. In those moments, she was carefree. In other instances, she revealed her fiery streak. Feisty Frederica would blurt out, "Darn it to heck," if she was tested, which life and my father ensured she was. It was this Frederica who thought nothing of throwing a hairbrush in my direction when I defied her. My father was a study in contrast. Even as a boy, he brimmed with the vitality that drew my mother to him. Magnetism coursed through his arteries. "Your father is a star," my cousin Bet would often say. She was right. Dad was artistically gifted, like all the Tysons. My father's cousin, Donald Walbridge Shirley, was the renowned classical and jazz pianist whose life is depicted in the 2018 Oscar award-winning film Green Book. My dad himself wasn't a trained musician, yet he played the guitar and sang with perfect pitch, enchanting all who heard his robust yet smooth vocals. And like my mother, he was a dresser and a stepper. Talk about a dapper Dan. That man had swagger. Like many soldiers, he wore metal heel taps on his shoes, and boy, you could hear him coming before long you saw him. Even when operating his produce stand, he strutted through the town in a stylish suit to go along with his air of confidence. My father also had an unpleasant face, one I'm still trying to reconcile with his other, more admirable ones. When he was good, he was very good. A man so committed to us that he often pushed around that cart 15 hours a day to keep our rent paid and our stomachs full. But when my father behaved badly, he was horrid. He was a womanizer. He never drank alcohol, but ego was his strong tonic. Throughout my childhood, he carried on illicit affairs around town. Maybe these sexual escapades allowed him to temporarily escape the burden of his circumstances, to forget the indignities of being black and poor. To be colored in early 20th century America was to brave an existence even more fraught with anxiety than our current times are. Whatever forces might have lured my father into the arms of other women, he did not resist. Word of my father's liaisons snaked through our community and slithered onto my mother's doorstep. Even before she heard tell of his infidelity, she'd spotted it in my father's every gesture, in the flecks of remorse on his brow. Much of the conflict between my parents happened behind closed doors. In the late evenings, as I lay huddled next to my brother and sister on the rollout bed, I'd hear Dad's footsteps as he stomped home after hours of revelry with various women. He wore his emotions on his feet. I knew by the thumpity thump of his heavy steps, that loud tapping of his heels, that war was coming. Bang, bang, bang. I don't know how Emily and Melrose slept through those ordeals, but they always seemed to. I'd overheard everything. I'd pretend to be knocked out as I quivered beneath my blanket, nursing my thumb in an effort to soothe myself. Occasionally their discord would spill over, like smoldering lava, into the kitchen and across the living room where we slept. When my parents' arguments when they became physical, I would leap from the bed and wedge my body in between theirs, pleading for my father to lower his voice and his hand. "Stop, Daddy," I'd wail, hot tears flooding my face as I banged on my father's chest. "Please stop. Leave my mother alone." That interrupted the fighting, but seldom did it end it. My parents would pick back up, they'd disappear in their bedroom, and carry on with their ruckus. Even with my childhood long behind me, I find it difficult to lay bare my parents' blemishes. My instinct is to protect their legacies in a world where we are too often demonized. My mom and dad, with all of their frailties, are part of a centuries-long story, a narrative, setting that hangs behind a myriad of black lives. That story harkens back to when our foreparents were herded onto ships, their naked bodies stacked row after row amid vomit and sewage for the treacherous Middle Passage. That tale continued as more than 200 years of enslavement pressed its foot down on our necks. Our men were emasculated and thrashed, our women raped and brutalized, our families ripped apart and auctioned off like cattle, our grueling labor uncompensated. We still bear the emotional and economic scars. In the days after my parents' clash, I often noticed another of my mom's dispositions, the reflective one. She would sit in her rocking chair in the bedroom, shaking her head and repeating under her breath, "This life, this life." A canvas bag filled with peanuts was her sole companion during those times. Every weekend she'd buy a pound of them. She'd give Emily, Melrose, and me a handful, and then she'd take her wooden chair, shelling those nuts one by one and peering out the window. I could feel her anguish. That is why I found it so bewildering that she'd occasionally kind of chuckle. "Why are you laughing, Mama?" I would ask. "Child," she'd whisper as she pulled another nut from the bag, "I'm laughing at my own calamities." As Mom rocked herself back and forth, I now imagined she was tucking away her sorrows, relegating them to the farthest corner of her heart, concealing them the way she did her mama's bills in those barrels. Dosha, the shy island girl, must have been secretly weeping over the abuse she withstood. But Frederica, the immovable oak with 3 children, whose survival rested upon her, kept much of her agony hidden. Okay, guys, we have finished 2 and 3. Thank you so much for coming and spending this time with me again, hearing the next 2 chapters. Oh my goodness, Lord, just hearing some of all of like how she grew up. It does make me think of some things in my own childhood and how things, weren't always great, but God has always been there no matter what. Again, thank you guys for coming in for story time with me. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, please let me know what stood out to you in this reading. What is something that maybe is a memory for you? Anything that you would like to share, please put it in the comments. And again, thank you for helping me get to 800. And you do have a chance on this video to join in for the giveaway. Remember, just put hashtag 800. You must be a visible subby of mine, and you must live within the 50 states and be 18 and over. Again, good night, guys.